If I were to ask you what invention of the 20th century has most affected your life, you might talk about the transistor or maybe cell phones or microwave ovens, but I suspect relatively few of you would mention a humble box. And yet, one very real candidate for the most important invention of the 20th century is just that, a specialized box that has profoundly changed the world that we live in. And you can buy one of your own for around $2,000. By some estimates, there are as many as 500 million intermodal shipping containers in the world today, and they move pretty much everything that can be moved for a fraction of what it used to cost. It is history that deserves to be remembered. A 2011 article in the Journal of Field Archaeology noted the surprising discovery in an archaeological site in Koskuntepe in northwest Turkey of 100 obsidian artifacts that had macroscopic characteristics indicating they'd come from the Greek island of Milos. The implication that there were regular routes of sea trade during the Neolithic era, as early as the 7th millennium BC. Sea trade was a critical factor in the growth of cities and civilizations, as Life Science noted in 2008. In the absence of proper roads, the most efficient way to transport goods from one place to another was by sea. Yet there was a problem, as the National Ocean Service of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration writes. For thousands of years, methods of shipping products across the ocean remained essentially the same. Products were brought to port in wooden crates, sacks, and kegs by wagons or later by trucks and trains. Ships were then loaded and unloaded crate by crate, sack by sack, and keg by keg. It was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Theft was a perpetual problem. Often a ship spent more time in ports, loading and unloading, than it would spend at sea. Shipping in such containers, called break-bulk shipping, continues today, especially in areas without robust port facilities. But clearly there's an advantage offered by standardizing cargo containers, and especially in making these containers intermodal, and thus easily transferred between boats and wagons. The website of shipping consultants Cargo Partner explains that in the 19th century, British merchants largely used early, semi-standardized containers that could be transported by horses and trains. This could be considered a first attempt at multimodal transport, especially for bulky cargo such as ore and coal, but also for bringing live fish to the towns farther inland. Container supplier MC Containers explains that in the 1830s, coal was transported by train in some continents. One railroad car could fit 4 simple containers made out of wood, and these were then loaded onto horse carriages that could fit 1 container. But it took some time for development. Cargo Partner notes that in the early 20th century in England and the U.S., people started using lift vans, stable wooden crates with metal eyelets at the upper ends. The holes made them easier to load by crane, for example, onto horse-drawn carriages. The term lift van is still used today to refer to a plywood crate, suitable for smaller shipments and sometimes standardized to fit in larger containers, but Cargo Partner notes the early lift vans faced difficulties. At first, the lack of standardization inhibited broader usage. Although lift vans became more popular once they agreed on their dimensions in the 1920s, their success was limited by the rounded tops, which made stacking impossible. These weren't the only attempts to standardize shipping containers in the early 20th century. The 1992 text Intermodal Marine Transportation, produced by the U.S. National Research Council, explains that mention is made of an 8 by 8 by 18-foot steel container that could be transferred among truck, rail, and ship modes being used by a moving company as early as 1906. Apparently, however, that remained an isolated innovation. Several railroads developed a less-than-carload, or LCL, container service using steel containers after World War I, with some railroads providing truck pickup and delivery. But again, the service didn't catch on. Railroad piggyback service with trailer on flat car and container on flat car was introduced in 1926, but the few containers involved were always shipped with their chassis. The use of piggyback carrying semi-tractor trailers on rail cars is still used today as a more efficient way of carrying truckloads long distances. But containerization, where the container is separate from the chassis, offers more flexibility, and as with many technologies, its development was closely associated with the military and the demands of wartime. NOAA's National Ocean Service explains that the advent of World War II brought new logistical challenges in supplying millions of U.S. and Allied troops overseas, and innovative approaches were needed to efficiently supply the war effort. During this period, small, standardized boxes full of war material were introduced to increase the American convoy's capacity to deliver wartime necessities. Cargo Partner writes that they designed rectangular boxes with a stable steel frame, which proved reliable for shipping but couldn't be stacked on top of each other. On the other hand, they did fit nicely on train cars, flatbed trucks, and into ship holds. But despite the development, Shipping Partner continues, these boxes were optimized continuously, but the combat ended before anyone managed to design the first robust and stackable container that was worthy of the name. That development would come after the war. In 1948, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps developed a rigid corrugated steel container called the transporter that was 8 foot 6 inches long, 6 foot 3 inches wide, and 6 foot 10 inches high. The stackable containers could carry approximately 9,000 pounds of cargo. Cargo Partner explains that the Army started with only 67 units, but it was immediately clear that the transporter would be very useful, especially right at the start of the Korean War. By 1953, the idea had been refined into the Container Express, or CONEX system. Cargo Partner writes, the size and the capacity of CONEX was roughly similar to the modified precursor it was based on. The system was also made modular, e.g. by adding a smaller unit with half the size. Up to 3 of these boxes could be stacked on top of each other, and thanks to their construction, they could protect their contents in any weather. CONEX, which could be stacked 3 high, proved extremely successful, and Cargo Partner writes that the U.S. military had acquired more than 200,000 boxes by 1967, when the demands of the Vietnam War again drove the need for more cargo transport. But Cargo Partner notes another development that is still seen in cargo transport today, and that the sturdy boxes had other uses. More than 3/4 of the CONEX boxes were shipped only once and actually remained in the combat zone, because to the soldiers, the containers themselves seemed just as practical as the contents that they transported. They were used as permanent storage options, formed temporary shelters and outposts, and even served as makeshift reinforcements of defensive structures. It is because of the CONEX system that Cargo Partner opines that the U.S. military is considered the inventor of the first standardized shipping container. But civilian versions were also being developed. Brian Cudahy wrote in the transportation journal TR News in 2006, to understand how and why the modern container ship evolved, turn back the calendar to Thanksgiving week in the pre-war year of 1937. The owner of a small trucking firm in North Carolina had ventured to New York Harbor with bales of export cotton to be loaded aboard a ship bound for Istanbul. The man grew irritated when he had to wait for days while longshoremen slowly loaded cargo aboard the vessel. One steamship executive suggested that it cost his company more to move cargo 1,000 feet from the street in front of the pier into the hold of a moored ship than it did to transport the cargo thousands of miles across a hostile ocean. Cudahy continues that the owner of the small trucking company was Malcolm McLean, and his North Carolina-based trucking company would grow into one of the nation's premier over-the-road cargo operations. Author Frank Holmes explained in Forbes magazine in 2022, Malcolm McLean may be the most important person you've never heard of. His claim to fame? Inventing a box, but not just any box. Cudahy noted McLean kept thinking about his experience in 1937 and the inherent limitations of loading cargo aboard ship. On a rainy April Thursday in 1956, he did something about it. Holmes wrote, a high school-educated truck driver from North Carolina, McLean came up with the idea of creating a series of standardized intermodal steel containers that could be neatly stacked on ships as well as trains and trucks. In his 2008 book, The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, Mark Levinson writes that his big insight was that the customer doesn't care how you're shipping the goods. The customer wants to get it from here to there cheap and on time. The customer doesn't care if it goes by air or land or sea. To bring his idea into practice, McLean again looked at the Second World War. The T-2 oil tanker was a class of oil tanker designed by the U.S. Shipping Board during the Second World War. 533 of the 501-foot, 6-inch long vessels with a beam of 68 feet and rated at 9,900 gross tons were built during the war. One of those was the SS Potrero Hills, built by the Marin Ship Corporation of Sausalito, California, completed in January of 1945. McLean's company purchased the ship in 1955 and renamed it the SS Ideal X and modified the ship, which made its first voyage in the new configuration on the 26th of April, 1956. Cudahy explains, installed above the vessel's main deck was a special spar deck, a raised platform or porch with longitudinal slots to which were attached the bodies of 58 trailer trucks. These were not trucks in any conventional sense. The 58 units had been detached from their running gear on the pier and had become containers. Arriving in Houston 6 days later, the 58 trailers were hoisted off Ideal X, attached to fresh running gear, and delivered to their intended destinations with no intermediate handling by longshoremen. McLean had orchestrated a pioneering voyage. McLean patented his apparatus for shipping freight in 1954, and in 1968, the International Standards Organization standardized his invention as a standard box, 20 foot long, 8 foot high, and 8 foot wide. McLean purchased a steamship company called Pan Atlantic and modified 3 other T2 tankers to carry cargo. Still, Cudahy explains, the vessels lacked essential characteristics that container ships have today. But McLean would soon improve the design, in a change that some would argue was as important as the advent of the space age, and, coincidentally, occurred on the same day. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first Earth-orbiting satellite, Cudahy writes, and on that same day, the Pan-Atlantic ship Gateway City steamed away from Port Newark and headed south to Miami, then on to Houston. Like the Ideal X, the SS Gateway City was originally designed for the Second World War as a Type C2 all-purpose cargo ship. But, Cudahy writes, Gateway City had been thoroughly rebuilt to stack containers one atop another in below-deck racks and to haul additional units stacked atop each other as deck cargo. The 524-foot Ideal X could handle 58 trailers, but the 450-foot Gateway City could accommodate 226. In many respects, Cudahy notes, the voyage of Gateway City signaled the onset of the contemporary container ship era. Both McLean's business and competitors began to develop the idea, and Holmes writes, in 1966, container shipping expanded to international routes. The changeover was not simple. Virginia Postrel reported in the New York Times in 2006, new equipment from dockside cranes to the containers themselves had to be developed. Carriers and shippers had to settle on standard container sizes. Ports had to strengthen their wharves, create connections to rail lines and highways, build places to store containers, and strike new deals with their unions. The process was not always smooth. Postrel continues that it is a classic tale of trial and error and of creative destruction. Levinson told the Times, almost everybody who was concerned with containerization in any way at some point got the story wrong. And Postrel notes that even the most foresighted people made mistakes and lost millions. Malcolm McLean himself bought fast, fuel-guzzling ships right before the 1973 oil crisis, and slow, economical ships just as fuel prices turned down. But containerization changed the world, Holmes writes in Forbes. According to one estimate, McLean's invention reduced the cost of shipping by 25%. I would argue the savings are many times greater than that, perhaps incalculably so. NOAA's National Ocean Service writes that the arrival of containers and intermodalism revolutionized the shipping industry. Containers could be efficiently stacked, allowing more and more goods to be transported across the seas. Labor costs were dramatically lowered, and since containers were sealed, theft was reduced. Over time, the marine transportation industry and the size of ships, trucks, trains, docks, and ports increased and expanded to handle the growing use of containers. The impact on global commerce was enormous, leading to a boom in international trade due to lower transportation and handling costs. In changing the way that goods were transported, containerization changed the very nature of port cities. The website of Container Management Incorporated writes that drastic changes in international shipping affected the ports and the cities that depended upon them for economic growth. With intermodalism, ports closer to rail and truck lines became preferred over other traditional port cities that were older and not designed for easy truck and train travel. Postrel writes that traditional dock workers and maritime managers found their skills obsolete or inadequate, and some smaller ports like Mobile, Alabama, lost business, while others like Seattle boomed. As London and Liverpool declined, the tiny town of Felixstowe gained 40% of Britain's container traffic. But perhaps even more profoundly, Container Management notes that the effect of intermodalism and containerization has changed not just the shipping industry, but modern life as we know it. Nowadays, you can get goods like wine from Europe, fruit from Central America, and fabric from Southeast Asia delivered to your door in a matter of days. It wasn't long ago where that would have seemed unfathomable to most people. How is that possible? The answer may be more straightforward than you imagined. A rectangular steel box, known as a shipping container. A 2021 edition of the journal Maritime Executive places the transformation in context. Take a look around you. Perhaps you're snacking on a banana, sipping some coffee, or sitting in front of your computer and taking a break from work to read this article. Most likely those goods, as well as your smartphone, refrigerator, and virtually every other object in your home, once were loaded onto a large container in another country and traveled thousands of miles via ships crossing the ocean before ultimately arriving at your doorstep. But the effect has not all been positive. Levinson told Vox in 2021 that starting in the late 1980s, businesses figured out how to combine cheaper shipping, thanks to containers, with cheaper telecommunications and improved computing to create long-distance supply chains. This helped to drive, Vox writer Rebecca Heilwell notes, a just-in-time approach to global manufacturing that left the world trade particularly vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, such as those caused by the COVID-19 outbreak, an issue that persists, as she explains, because of widespread manufacturing delays and bottlenecks. There aren't enough of these boxes in the right place and at the right time. The Maritime Executive estimates that about 90% of the world's goods are transported by sea, and of those about 60%, or $14 trillion in goods annually, are transported in containers. McLean's original 20-foot containers become so standard that it is now a unit of measurement, TEUs, or 20-foot units, and the largest container ships today can carry a whopping 24,000 TEUs. In fact, the size of the ships themselves has become a bit of a problem. In 2022, the colossal Panama-flagged MV Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked the canal for 6 days at an estimated cost of about $9 billion in world trade each day. And just this last March, the mid-sized container ship Dahlia caused the collapse of Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge, despite only carrying around 10,000 containers. Killed 6 people and has driven a cost that's still not been determined, but will at least be in the billions of dollars. Malcolm McLean passed away on May 25th, 2001, at the age of 87. In his obituary, the Baltimore Sun wrote that he stands up there with Robert Fulton as one of the greatest revolutionaries in the history of maritime trade, and yet they note that for someone who transformed global commerce, he died in relative obscurity. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.